So we have reached the end of an era with the X-Men movies, here now with Dark Phoenix, and was this a satisfying conclusion to the 11-year X-Men franchise? So Dark Phoenix is directed by Simon Kinberg and stars Sophie Turner as Jean Grey, who begins to develop incredible powers that corrupt and turn her into a Dark Phoenix. Now the X-Men will have to decide if the life of a team member is worth more than all of humanity. First off, I'd just like to quickly address why I've been gone for so long and why I haven't reviewed anything. I have been incredibly ill over the past few weeks. I've had basically just been bed-stricken for many weeks dealing with gastroenteritis, so I do apologise for that. I've had no reviews. I've barely been to the cinema, like I haven't seen Godzilla. There are a couple of movies I did manage to see, like I did manage to see Late Night, which was really good. I also managed to see Rocketman, but I haven't been able to review them, so I do apologise for that. But reviews are back now. We'll be back, reviewing movies as usual, so I do want to apologise for that little 2-week or so kind of stint without any videos, but we are back now, and we are now here to review Dark Phoenix. So I have to say, I'm very hit and miss with the X-Men movie franchise. There are some movies that I absolutely love, and there are other movies that I'm not too hot on. I mean, I've put some movies here, which you can see, and I knocked my TV. You can see that there are some movies here, like X-Men First Class, which in my opinion is the best X-Men movie. That's my personal favourite. Then you've got Days of Future Past, which is also a great film. But then you've got like a movie like Apocalypse, which was not too strong. And then you've got other movies like, you've got the original trilogy, which the first two are pretty great, but then you have The Last Stand, which was really not that hot. You got X-Men Origins Wolverine, which is terrible. The Wolverine, which was alright. Then you got Logan, which I consider to be absolutely incredible, and maybe the best of them all as well, alongside First Class. So the X-Men movies are very hit and miss, and Dark Phoenix was a movie that I wasn't sure how I was going to take to, because not only were they adapting the Dark Phoenix storyline yet again, but they were also doing it in a way that was just very reminiscent to The Last Stand, a movie we had already gotten. And with this movie, it just feels completely pointless. Starting off with positives though, I do like the majority of the performances in this movie. Not all of them, but definitely the majority of them. In particular, obviously Michael Fassbender as Magneto, and also James McAvoy as Charles Xavier. They are both phenomenal in this movie, as they have been, this entire series. They've been great. Just their kind of friendship and their power. Even though Magneto is not in this movie as much as I would have liked him to have been, you do get to see, and Charles and Eric don't really share as many scenes together as in the previous films. It was still really nice, and just them two individually were great performances. And also I have to say, Sophie Turner really impressed me in this movie. I wasn't a big fan of Sophie Turner in X-Men Apocalypse. When they introduced her as Jean Grey, I just thought she was a bit weak and a bit bland in that movie, as was, I felt, most of the cast in Apocalypse. But in this movie, I think Jean Grey and Sophie Turner really delivered a powerful performance, really strong. And again, I was very impressed by that. And as someone who, doesn't really watch Game of Thrones, I know a lot of people who, have been saying Sophie Turner is a really great actress on Game of Thrones. I don't really keep up with Game of Thrones, so for me, the last time I really saw her acting-wise was in X-Men Apocalypse, which again, like I said, I wasn't a big fan of, but here in Dark Phoenix, much stronger, and again, really sold everything that she was trying to portray, and I really loved her in this movie. Also, the score in this movie is phenomenal. Hans Zimmer absolutely knocked it out of the park with this movie, because this score really elevates a lot of these scenes, which in retrospect and in singularity are not that impressive. The scenes themselves don't really do that much to really bolster the movie in any kind of way. The movie just kind of falls flat without this score, and that's a big precedent to say for Hans Zimmer's score here, because it's so well crafted, it's so beautiful to listen to, and again, I'm actually looking forward to downloading the soundtrack for this movie, because it's just absolutely brilliant, and it just proves again why Hans Zimmer is one of the best composers in Hollywood. Moving over to the negative side of things though, the CGI in this movie is very questionable. I mean, it's not all bad. There are a couple of scenes that do look fine, but there are a lot of other scenes, definitely more than there should be for a movie with this budget, that just look very questionable. Especially, there's a couple of scenes that take place in Cerebro, which is obviously, Professor X's kind of mindscape, and it just looks terrible. Like, the CGI looks awful. And there are a couple of scenes like that as well that take place during the action sequences that I was completely put off by, and it really takes you out of the movie sometimes when you have really bad and weak looking CGI. And for a movie like this, which has like an over $200 million budget, we really shouldn't be seeing stuff like this, and it's just disappointing to see a movie of this scale in this franchise having this incredibly weak CGI. The script in this film is also very weak and very basic. It's very typical superhero, very typical hero-villain kind of dialogue. There's nothing particularly outstanding about it. There's nothing particularly, profound about it. The X-Men movies typically do have really good dialogue because of its political nature, but this movie has none of that. This movie really has no kind of political stance or any kind of individuality to it in comparison to the other films, and that also comes into the fact that this movie takes place in the 1990s, and if you wouldn't have known that going in, you probably wouldn't have been able to tell, because there's no indication that this movie takes place in the 90s, other than the fact that we've kind of known about it because First Class was the 60s, Days of Future Past was the 70s, Apocalypse was the 80s, and now Dark Phoenix is the 90s. It just makes no sense, and it just feels like this movie is just in the 90s, and there's no kind of indication to it, and that was really disappointing, and that comes through in the script as well. This film also suffers from a weak villain. This movie just didn't need a villain, but for some reason they chucked in Jessica Chastain, who, granted, does the best she can with it. I mean, Jessica Chastain is a phenomenal actress, but she did not need to be in this movie. Like, that character and that whole race of aliens that they introduced in this movie, what was the point of them? I mean, they were there to harness energy, but it was kind of just like, without them, if you take them out of the movie, it's completely different. There's no difference to the movie whatsoever if you remove those characters, because the movie is about a central conflict between the X-Men and Jean Grey. So why are we throwing in this third party? It makes no sense to me, and again, they just felt completely superfluous. I did not need them in this movie, and they just felt like they were taking up unnecessary screen time. Also, in regards to the characters, this movie doesn't do a good job of establishing relationships, in particular the relationship between Scott Summers and Jean Grey. That relationship is so powerful in the comics, and it's one of Marvel's best relationships, but in the X-Men movies they've always managed to underserve it, and in this in particular, I mean, they first met in X-Men Apocalypse. We were first introduced to these versions of these characters in X-Men Apocalypse, and there was no real indication of a relationship there, even though we all knew it had to happen at some point. But it was no kind of indication in Apocalypse itself, and then in Dark Phoenix they're just instantly in a relationship and they expect the audience to buy it, and you just don't, because you've never seen these characters really interact for more than 5 minutes. So it just feels incredibly rushed and incredibly forced, and it leads to Cyclops getting one of the most unintentionally funny lines in the film. And with this movie comes incredibly poor direction. You can just see it all throughout the film. This movie was directed by Simon Kinberg. This was his feature directorial debut. And for taking somebody and giving them a $200 million budget X-Men movie as their feature debut, it's not a good idea. It's not a good sign, and this movie proves it. I mean, I was optimistic for Simon Kinberg because he's been so heavily involved in this franchise for many, many years. And you can see that there is passion there. But I feel like the direction overall, it just comes across as inexperienced. You can just see the way the characters move, the way that certain actors, it just seems like they're not quite sure how they're supposed to play certain scenes. There are many scenes that kind of come across as overly emotional or under-emotional, because it seems like they only maybe took 1 or 2 takes and that was it. It just feels like the director didn't have the experience required to tackle a big movie like this, and I feel like maybe they should have gone with a different choice other than Simon Kinberg to direct this. Again, I have all the respect in the world for Simon Kinberg. He seems like a lovely guy, and, fair play to him for, undertaking this movie. But I feel like maybe Fox should have just maybe let him stay in the producer role and allowed someone with a bit more of experience to take over this franchise and finish it off, because this was an incredibly poorly directed movie. Overall, Dark Phoenix was an incredibly underwhelming end to the X-Men franchise. I mean, we all kind of expected it. But, given the fact that this movie and this franchise has built up so many fans and, such an awesome little movie franchise over the years, to end in such a down note like this with one of the weaker films in the franchise, I don't think it's the worst. I don't think it's as bad as some people say it is. I don't think it's the worst. I don't think it's as bad as, like, X-Men Origins Wolverine or anything like that. But it's quite shocking that this movie is not really as good as The Last Stand, and that is where the problems lie with this film. A really weak script, completely pointless and superfluous villain, a really poor direction, and this film just lacks a lot of the energy that the other X-Men movies have. Even Apocalypse, which, granted, Apocalypse is not a good film, but it even had more energy and felt like it had more passion behind it than Dark Phoenix did. And it's a real shame, because this movie felt pointless going into it, and coming out of it, it did kind of feel like I wasted my time. So have you guys seen Dark Phoenix? If you have, make sure you let me know all your thoughts about it in the comment section down below. Did you like it? Did you hate it? Let's have a conversation about this movie in the comment section down below. And as always, guys, if you want to see more movie reviews from me, be sure to subscribe. Stay tuned for my reviews of Men in Black International coming out. And also, I might do some quickie reviews of Rocketman and Late Night as well. So make sure you subscribe and stay tuned for them. And I hope to see you guys again next time.